tēnā koutou e whakarongo maina ki tēnei o ngā kaupapa a te mātāwai. E hari ko ana tēnā kau te hara mai tēnei ahiahi, taha o taku tūnane, o waku tūnane, ki te kōrero mo te whakarauora reo. Ko Rawinia Higgins tōku ingoa no te whāru o Ratoki ahau, ko tūhoi tōku iwi, koe te toihau o te taurewhiri i te reo Māori, ka mutu i whai wāhi anō au ki roto i a te mātāwai i ona wā, i te tīmatanga mai o te mātāwai. Nō reira, he koana tēnā kau te hoki mai ki te tautoko i ngā mahi a te mātāwai o sira te tautoko kia ora te whare o te reo Māoriora me ki. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou.
Kia ora.
Tēnā ki koe, tēnā tātou. Ko Poia tēnei mā tātua te aroa nā waka. Nei mai hoki mai ki tēnei maihi o te whare te tuine. Ko koe rā tērā i toko ake i tērā mahi te timatanga. Anā ke kune koe toko ana i tētahi o nā maihi tēnei wā. Mai kore pakiri ai te tū o tēnei whare o te reo Māoriora.
Kia ora. O rere tō te pātai tuatahi e whiu nei ki au kūrua. Tēnā whakamārama hia mai ki te hunga e whakarongo nei ki a tātou. Kōrero ana mo te whare o te reo Māoriora me ki. Nā taha e rua.
I tikina ko te whare o te reo Māoriora hei kupu whakarite mo te āhua o te whakarauora reo. Mōhio ana tātou kei roto i o tātou whare tipuna he taha whaiti, taraiti, he taha whānui tō te whare, ko te taranui tērā. Ka mutu i whakaro ake ko te taha ki te taraiti kia te mātāwai, i runga ko te taha ki te ki te taranui ko te karauna. I runga anō i te whakaro i mua i te ture mo te reo Māori, te mea hou nei, I waho tonu te iwi Māori i roto i ngā hangana rautaki reo Māori, ko te karauna tonu i te hana i aua rautaki, ko te taha ki te Māori he tono no atu ki te karauna, kia whawhati mai he hua, he konga rānei, rauimi ki te tautoko i ngā kaupapa te iwi Māori. Me te mea hoki e mōhio nei tātou, ko te nuinga o ngā kaupapa whakarauora reo i ahu mai i roto i ngā hapori Māori, i ngā iwi, i ngā kaupapa Māori, ko tā te kāwanatanga he ārahi i ngā rawa ka taka mai ki a wai. Nō reira, ko te āhua o taua whare e whai ana ki ngā rangahau e pāna ki te whakarauora reo. So te whare o te reo Māoriora follows language planning and policy theories around micro language planning versus macro language planning. And of course, before te ture mo te reo Māori, a vast majority of the strategy for language revitalisation lay largely in the hands of the Crown, with the Crown strategies, and consequently guided the way in which we think about language revitalisation. When we had the opportunity to review the legislation, we took it upon ourselves to bring everybody inside the whare as a way to kind of think around what is the desires of iwi Māori in terms of intergenerational language transmission. That's a fundamental to language revitalisation, but also there's an obligation on the side of the Crown to support and create conditions around language revitalisation so that hopefully in a more joined up and at least coordinated way we're working together. I had the privilege of being on the board of the establishment board of Te Mātāwai in terms of setting the strategy around the Maihi Māori. Consequently got pushed over to the other side of the whare to Taurewhiri Te Reo Māori to be able to lead out the Maihi Karauna and hopefully get some cohesion between the Te Whare o Te Reo Māoriora.
Poia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, mārama hoki ko Rawinia ki te kaiarataki te ropu tohu i te rāwā, ana hoto māua, tō tātou pāpara tērā, ho mai. Hei whakamarumaru i a mātou I tērā wā. Ana nāna no nā kōrero, kia kaua nā pakitara e whawhai tētahi ki tētahi. Engari, ai ki tātaku utu e nene, whakahui a gira tu I te whare, e pai te kōrero tahi.
And I suppose this sort of dovetails quite nicely too into Te Kura Roa, and and just sort of examining what that might look like in terms of our understanding for our whānaus listening in today. So we're looking at the purpose of Te Kura Roa, and how did that sort of come about in terms of the development there?
Well, I tutu ki a mātou waiata mō tea te onai tūoi, ko te wai ki te kōti mo pine te kura. Ana ko te kura nui, ko te kura roa tērā. Ana ko te kura tangata, he tangata te kura. Nā re tīkena mea ko te rā tauira hoki. He utanga mō a māua mahiranga hewi tērā wā. No muri mai tērā I e tono māu e nāpai o te māramatanga. Nā reri whiwhai māu I rungi tā rāua tono. Kaua e riro mā te tono noiho ki nāpai o te māramatanga, engari he mōhio no Maryland mai tērā wā. Ka tīkina mai ko māua hei āta arotahi ki te reo. Mo te toru tau, kaua mo te tau kotahi noiho nei, te takau mahi a marama, engari mea āta whakapau ngā rauemi, a pūtea tangata hoki ki te kaupapa, kia eke, nā rere koe te whānautanga mai o te kura roa.
Ka mutu ko te tono mai a ngā pai kia māua, kia rangahau I te hua o te reo Māori. Ka mutu I te wā I tai mai te tono kia māua e whakaro ake, māma noiho tēnā. Whakaro ake, kuri noa nei, ka māma tēnā kaupapa. Engari, I kite māua, arā ke te whānuitanga o tērā kaupapa, me timata kihia, pehea nei te whakamaori, te whakatinana I tēnei mea te hua o te reo Māori, te ruku hōhonu ki roto I tērā kaupapa o te hua o te reo. Koenei I tāpiri hoki ko te kura roa tēnā. But, in all reality, that research project became the catalyst for a number of things for both Poia and I to explore, what is the value of te reo Māori to our hapori? What is the value of the reo inside with the Crown? And have the opportunity to work alongside kaupapa such as te kohanga reo and te Ahorangi more directly. And the part that Poia looked after was working with the Crown agencies to see to what extent did the value of the language apply in those spaces. And through that research, we were able to draw down a number of conclusions around people's attitudes and behaviours towards te reo. So we understand intrinsically for many Māori, he tino taonga te reo Māori. We have many pepeha, kōrero, whakatauki, he taonga te reo rangatira, no tātou tīpuna, and, as Māori, we hold fast to those sayings, but then we speak English. And so we were trying to unpack why people's attitudes might be very strong sense of connection to the reo, but that didn't always translate into use. And so we were trying to work out what are the things that became barriers or obstacles within, two different kind of frames. And
So it's like after the ceremonial practices are finished on the marae, then everyone switches back to English.
Yeah.
And kapai.
But I think the model two area, because of the tripartite agreement between University of Auckland, University of Victoria, University of Otago at that time, I think it showed a demonstration of trying to work together rather than one leading out from one particular area. So we thought we had the country covered, Auckland, Wellington, then Southland, Otago. So I think the model was also an attempt to also pick up on the whare o te reo Māori and bring more entities together and move away from the individualism.
Ka pai. And I suppose that really sort of reinforces too what we're trying to do at the Mātāwai in terms of that support there for our communities and community projects and programs, and with the emphasis of encouraging our whānau to speak Māori within the home and the intergenerational exchange of our reo.
Well, they bought Rawinia purely because of the intellect. They just go along for the good looks.
Ka pai.
But I think you're right. So, and, you know, when we were trying to look at, you know, I mean, how te hua te reo Māori, what is the value of te reo Māori? It's putting in what is the value proposition to our people. And so understanding that there's actually a whole range of values that people will apply to the reo and consequently can, condition the way they use te reo Māori. So as I said before, intrinsically, you know, you'd be hard pushed to find many Māori who wouldn't say that te reo is not a taonga or is not important from an intrinsic cultural, spiritual level. That, you know, you probably get, you know, a lot of amene to that proposition.
Absolutely.
But then you add a different kind of proposition, in such as education, educational value. And we see just in the way kohanga reo, kura kaupapa, whare kura, wānana, just in terms of the numbers we have, kind of give us a different message on how do we understand that. And, you know, there are other elements to language revitalisation where we've, you know, over the past 50 years have put a lot of effort in, and often people are still trying to understand what is the value that they add, mainly for those hapori, for example. But how do you get masses of people to shift along a continuum of saying, actually, I can see the relevance, I see the value in this. And how does that influence policymakers in terms of the way they design policy that encourages people to want to use more reo?
Ka pai. Thank you, Rawinia, for that. And so if we just go to Poia now and we talk about maybe some of the value of the reo and some of that research around the value of the reo and what does that sort of, you know, bring to the fore in terms of those insights?
I sort of teared on from Rawinia's comment about impacting on policy. You know, one small little product of that was that publication, but come back to the value and all of the different entities in here, that value as from their own positions, their own perspectives, which I think is the maturity we're having as Māori. If you remember back in the day, everyone was Māori. Then you became Ngāti mea, and then you became your hapu, started becoming more prevalent. I think when we looked at the value of the reo was the same as there's so many nuances in the value that are different. We need to start to be more cognizant with those and be able to address them as they pertain to each individual or grouping. You know, I think that's where we've developed over the years, that there's no one value for just for the three of us. So we need to look at the disciplines as diverse as they are, and now start to dig deeper into how they view the reo as a taonga in their respective areas.
Yeah, and I suppose it's probably true that what we're seeing now in terms of this renaissance that we're going through as a country, with the, you know, our reo and that coming to the fore, being broadcast on the mainstream television, the usage there within radio, and you know, that ability of mainstream society and that to embrace the importance of learning the reo. And I'm assuming it's going to come to a time where the reo and the tikanga and everything's going to be merged into one. But I mean, just want to sort of, you know, dig a little bit deeper in terms of your thoughts, Rawinia and Poia, around that, considering you're, you know, pretty much deemed as the architects of a lot of this, and in terms of the writings and the research. So, yeah.
I think maybe just taking a step back before going into where we are today. So when we produced this, Poia and I were able to also present the ZePA model, or kopa, which is often called right shifting or left shifting. And a part of that was drawn from the research that we collected and some of the triggers that made someone either zero position or made them passive, right through to being active. And I think one of the things that just want to acknowledge Te Māngai Pāho, particularly because they gave us an opportunity to introduce the ZePA model in terms of how do we right shift people into an active space as part of the way they conceptualise the mahi that they do, and using broadcasting as a way, or broadcast funding as a way to allow producers of content to think about how they increase or commit to an increase in the use of te reo, so that they had a plan around that. And so Te Māngai Pāho were one of the first early adopters, and it's starting to be picked up by others as well. And that kind of brings us around to where we are today in terms of te whare o te reo Māoriora, that sense of understanding the difference between macro language planning and micro language planning. The need to be able to support micro language planning in a way that promotes intergenerational language transmission, so that those values, the different types of values, are embedded in there. But the macro space has to be aware of them, and sometimes it's around the critical awareness part to language revitalisation that people are not necessarily all that au fait on. And what you're seeing is, now that there's a little bit more clarity on what is the role of the state in supporting and creating those conditions, is not to jump into our homes and try and, you know, directly impact our families, but actually ensure that our communities and our society in general sees the value of the language to them, that it is, you know, the first language of this country, and it's become a defining feature of our country. And so if you want to be identified from this country, you really can't avoid te reo. And so whether it's in haka, whether it's in, you know, the place names, it's very much part of the fabric of society. So understanding that space in the macro, in order to allow our tamariki and our mokopuna to not be whakamā, to use te reo Māori and to want to use te reo Māori, because that has been a barrier in the past, that, you know, this perception that there's no value of te reo Māori outside your kōhanga or your kura, and even restoring it back into our homes. So it's kind of, so the ZePA model is around how do we ensure that people move along. It's not a proficiency scale. It's around what are the things we need to do to move people, particularly out of zero and at least into passive, and if not even better, from passive to active users of te reo.
Ka point.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the model was looked at the language as a bit of stop-start at the time. So like the zebra crossing you have, you know, so then when you saw a zephyr drive by, so tried to mold these two together, came up with the ZePA model. So the zero component, they came across just over part of the research. We started to look at different individuals and who would engage with who would talk with Rawinia and Māori, who wouldn't, and that she's fluent but wouldn't engage with her. So, and myself as well, and looked at our own families, and actually that's what really brought us to the whole model was, there's some passive speakers there. What stops them being passive and actually moving to be active? Or the active speakers, you know, especially the Rawinia is fun, all fluent as, and native speakers not speaking Māori. So, and that's that left shifting that the Rawinia is talking about. So the zero, really, those are tunga kawa nei ki te reo Māori, Tenga hunga horokuku nei ki te reo Māori, te ia nei ki a mate te reo Māori, tēnā hunga, ka mate rā te aku nei, hoi no, ai te ne waka i te ora tonu. So the model looked at those really reluctant to the zero, back then was about those really reluctant to engage the language, no receptivity whatsoever, no acknowledgement of it in its space in Aotearoa anywhere. Rather did die like the proverbial more and other things. And then we moved into the passive, but you know, when you spoke with the Māngai Pāho, there's been some refinements have gone on there. I understand. I didn't know them intricately. But there are phases across the passives as well. Say, are you low passive, medium passive, or high passive? And then the active, are you low active, medium active, or high active? So those are, it's just the shifts, as when it says, not to grade you and say, are you a A plus or are you a D? But what's your potential to shift? That's the whole focus of the model. What's the potential to shift? Right shift, I'm saying.
But also in the ways of what does it take to make them shift? And so, and how do we ensure that, you know, for some, you know, I know when we were talking at TMP, you know, jumping straight into fluent, you know, 100% content can be a left shifter for a lot of people because they can't keep up with the content. And so thinking around, you know, different approaches of how do you increase more language over a range of shows so that you're kind of drip feeding for those who need more coaxing along the spectrum as opposed, but there's still also a need for those 100% programs. And so how do you plan in a way that caters for many, but also keeps people hooked into that space as well. And so part of it is not just, okay, I'm going to add another sentence next week, but it's also around what else needs to be added and reinforced to encourage use. But Poia's right, you know, part of the way we did it in our research was we would present scenarios to people around, if I gave you a house and a tax rebate, if you just use the reo and nothing else. If I gave you a car, or I paid for, you know, just kind of what were the things that would switch people into an active zone. And we were a little bit shocked, maybe naive, that some people just went, nah.
Well,
You know, we're just like putting out, you know, we're putting stuff on the table to say, would you speak te reo in your home if we gave you this? You know, some pretty serious stuff, you know, moving into the realms of how the kibbutz would work. And there was a lot of no. And part of it, there was their own internal dynamic of, that's just too hard. I couldn't commit to that. And part of it goes back to the values that, you know, the value proposition in and of itself. And, you know, depending on the value, would certainly send people back in the left shift them. So we were trying to work out what are the things that can help right shift them along that spectrum.
So, in other words, then we're sort of creating those safe spaces, those contexts which they, you know, can enter into, and, you know, like feeding the birds with some breadcrumbs and do it the next day, and the birds come back and you keep feeding them, and next thing you know, you've got all of these manu, you know, on your paddock that you can't get rid of, really. And
Then it's in your oven.
then it's in the oven. Ka pai, I like that. Yeah. Well, the bird part and the oven. But yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can see how that works. And I suppose if you're forced into a situation where you have to do it, you know, it's like going to another country and you have to speak a totally different reo in order to survive. Then you have to do it. But then there's, you know, obviously going to be a resistance along the way. And I think back to when I started on my reo journey. And I'm still on it, and went from 0 to Te Tohu Paitahi, and with native speakers and the likes of Hereni or Tokoro Nei Papa, Hereni Melbourne, and Te Whare and all of those Timoti, and they were all within the Tari Māori and Poia, and yeah, I was, you know, passive. But I definitely wasn't active. Yeah. And so it took a long time for me to, well, at least a couple of years to have that confidence to be able to communicate at that particular level. So, yeah, I can totally understand where a lot of our whānau are coming from in terms of that journey.
But often it is those taniwha, like, you know, a little bit mataku, because you're in amongst, you know, some of the greatest speakers of all, and it is intimidating. And I think that is where a lot of our research we saw a lot of people in that space, that it was, how do you rein in the taniwha? And, you know, proficiency is one of those taniwha, you know, mataku, whakamā, All of those things that really are, significant left shifters for us as iwi Māori or language learners, that really can just kind of make you go from active in one situation because you feel comfortable to zero in like 0 seconds, just by somebody walking into the room. And, all second language learners go through, some of that, they get a bit wetter as soon as, people walk in, they're intimidated. And it doesn't matter how lovely and encouraging those mātanga can be, they still just freeze and then become zero or a little bit passive, a lot of I to the questions they ask you, and you really want to engage, but you just go, I matua or I fire, and then that's it. You just stop, and you go afterwards. You often kind of beat yourself up because you think, I knew how to say that. I wanted to say more, but and it's that internal dynamic that can really impact on whether someone is left shifted or whether they. And for other people, it's the total opposite. They are spurred on by, I'm going to do this. He mai, tika mai. They'll just go, they go for gold. But everyone's different. Their internal dynamic is different. And none of us are the same. And it's kind of understanding, what are the things that make you mataku or whakama? And how can we overcome them?
Yeah, and I think some of those examples are bang on because that's why you stop letting Rawinia go into those forums because everyone keeps quiet when she's in the room, So, but I think we've been, both of us have taught language and talk about the naivety, but didn't know any better at that time. You didn't have all these other avenues to acquire the language back then. And I think generically we moved them into places where the language was the environment. Whereas now we actually go back and say, what's the environment where you feel comfortable as a person, as an individual, and now the language goes to you there. We tended to move everyone from the East Coast, we put them all to Waikato, to Victoria, they go down south, and they're away from whānau, away from the areas they grew up in. So already you started to remove or some of the confidences they naturally had. But this is just the evolution of our language and how it's now been picked up.
I think as we're starting to be more critical, as Poia said, around research, particularly around language revitalisation theories and the like, exactly what Poia's talking about is, that creation of domain, the language domain and how you create that and how you create that in the home and how you create that in your workplace and how you create it in your kura or wherever you want to in terms of that, your setting being comfortable, but also how you make that a rumaki. And for some, that might just be, and how you create that rumaki might be dependent on the wā, a time. It might be a particular time, or it might be the context, or the wāhi itself lends itself to being naturally wāhi kōrero Māori. And so, when I think about where I work at the university, there are spaces I already know are conducive to kōrero Māori, usually by the nature of who's there or whose space it is. And there are times where I know I just have to flip back into English, otherwise people just kind of nod at me and just go, okay, she might have lost, I think she's forgotten she's at the university today and not at the Māori Language Commission.
Yeah, and I think with the whole model, you talk about the right shifting and the left shifting was, we have no evidence here, I'm talking about the Rawinia and I, but we'd like to hope that over the years, Māori or speaking communities, that the fault line, when they get uncomfortable, is not left shifting, but their fault line is always right shifting, albeit fractional, but it means when I don't want to speak, I'm not going into non-speaking as long as I might have been. So the default position is creeping along that the right shift.
So in other words, we're building and creating that capacity, whether it be in the kāinga or out in those spaces within the community that we're speaking to reo.
Well, it's certainly a long game, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if intergenerational is not going to be done in a short period of time, which does, of course, has its own challenges in terms of how we measure, how we feel like whether we're succeeding or not. Often when you're very much immersed in trying to whakarawara your own whānau, you feel like it's just kind of Groundhog Day, because you feel like you're not making the same, or you're not making the leaps into the active. But actually, as Poia said, this is, it's a gradual approach. And I think, for me, I always try to liken the language revitalisation like a relay race. And, you're working with different runners. So there's you, as you might be the first runner, carrying the baton, and you put in all this effort, whakapau o kaha, ki te hanga I tētahi rumaki reo, for your whānau or for your mahi. And then you got to make sure that the next runner or the next generation wants to pick that up, because of course they're different. You may have created the first generation of native speaker back for your whānau. So they've got their starting point is different. They already have reo, but you want them to be able to pass it on to mokopuna. So that starts a different way of continuing along right shifting. And we have to be cognizant that what we do in our generation is maybe as the first runner, if you're the first runner, that and you've created that first language speaker, that you want them to be critically aware around why they want to carry that baton, and not drop it and say, oh, well, kei au te reo, kei te pai noiho te reo. But we have to instill in that sense of critical awareness of why they want to carry that on to the next generation, and not just assume by the time they have kids, ka māma ake.
Ara mau ki nā kaupapa I tēnei wā, ne mo te tino rangatira me te mana motu ake. Nā kira ki te pakari hāretanga o tātou nei iwi. As we get self-determined, you'd like to hope that we're not as sensitive as we used to be, and our skin's a bit tougher. Yeah. Because you take the criticism, that's what causes the left shifting. Yeah. But as our people get more, they develop more in their self-esteem and know their value, then we'd like to think that again is, you're not going to throw me off for much longer now. And the timuji karete, you're not going to stop me from speaking now. The mamai poto no yo nei nei.
Well, and I think that's a valid point that you're making there, because there's an expectation or assumption, and I mean I make it all the time, my own tamariki, thinking that they're going to speak to reo at home and out in the community, or get up and do lead karakia and that, and they just sit there and zoop, they say nothing. And I was thinking to myself, man, what have we been doing wrong for the last 15 years, So it's got to this point where they're very reluctant to do any of that. But then when you're in a different space, and a place where they feel comfortable, next minute they're leading it. And I just can't believe it. So it's exactly what you're just talking about there. So left shift, right shift.
I think Rawinia makes the strongest point, which I think is still facing us, the biggest challenge, is how do you get now the next generation or two generations as impassioned to make sure the language is regenerated in their own tamariki mokopuna. I think that's the bigger challenge. Easy to teach, but as Rawinia says, to have the next generation pick it up is the big challenge. So I look forward to that research, Professor Higgins.
I think, both what you've have been saying is really pertinent for us, because it goes to the point you made, it's around that comfortability. So for those who are the first runner, often, understand what language loss feels like, and, how hard it is to do this mahi. But if you've created a generation of first language speakers, their sense of loss is not the same. And so their ao is framed totally differently. And so it's how do you create those comfortable domains for your tamariki to take it to a different space. And we as Pākeke of children, adult children, have to be cognizant that we need them to fly in their own way and not assume that just because we did it this way, that's the way that they'll want to do it. Because I think, a living language, needs to thrive with the people who are driving it. And so I'm really excited to see where our rangatahi take us in the next part of this journey. I've reflected over during Te Petihana mo Te Reo Māori, the 50 years, and, I did a lot of interviews and thinking about the tauira from Ngā Tamatoa and Te Reo Māori society who largely had no reo, and where they've brought us to today. And we're totally living in a different space to where they were 50 years ago. Yeah. And so, they're probably thinking, what's going on now? But I'm kind of excited to see where rangatahi Māori take us into the next phase of our journey. That might create totally different domains that are not our domains. We're not comfortable in them, whether they're on social media, whether they're, in the way they connect with each other. And we just hope that Te Reo will also be part of that, so we don't drop the baton in that space.
Any sort of concluding comments or whakaaro, what we discussed in terms of the ZePA model and our kōrero today in terms of our whakarau ora reo?
Ari me whakapono. Te whakapono kai nā rangatai o te wāne. Ne tiro ki nā kiriata me ngā pikiti o huka me te raiona kingi te reo Māori. Nā momo wae te putana I te maria. Kai nā manurere paororo ana. I think it's just heartening to see that the language is finding rooting itself in other areas.
Yeah.
So I hope my tuhin is right and the next generation has already started to pick up that pattern.
Kia kaua hoki tātou e kaiponu, me tō tātou reo, me tukuna kia rere, me tukuna kia kōrero, koena te oranga o te reo, kia kōrero hia tō tātou reo. And we really do, as much as we know it's a taonga, we need to also share that taonga. Because, living languages need people to be using the language. And we want to encourage people to use as much language as possible, whether it's iti or nui, to try and at least stay on the direction of travel of the right shifting towards active. And kia kaua tātou hoki whakate maui, koe mate anō tō tātou reo.
Ka pai. O tēnā kōrua, tō mātou te whiwhi o te mātāwai, te kōrero. Nei kia kōrua tahi, e whakatako tō kōrua nei e whakaro mo te whakarau ora reo. Nō reira, tō mātou te whiwhi, o tira, tēnā kōrua. Stay tuned for part 2, where Poia will speak to Larry Parr about the ZePA model.